As we remember President Carter, we should recognize that he had a significant influence in this country. So what was his impact? Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Jonathan Sides.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
So President Nixon was arguably one of the most popular presidents until he was forced out of office because he covered up a break-in at the Watergate Hotel. And then afterwards, President Ford comes in, and he has a situation where do you pardon him, do you not pardon him? And he pardoned him, and a lot of people thought that he shouldn't have been pardoned, that Nixon shouldn't have been pardoned. And so that's kind of the situation that President Carter comes into office. And so he had a pretty difficult situation. But looking back, people now, they look at his presidency as a pretty much a total failure. And they look at his post-presidency as a complete success. What was his true legacy?
I think as people, look at the news, because we're recording this before he has passed away, but we're planning to release it afterwards. And I expect, so we don't know what the coverage is going to be like afterwards, but I think from a lot of the Christian media, I think there's going to be a lot of coverage of him as a Christian and as a Christian president. And that's something that, I think we definitely want to discuss is how far, was he living out, a Christian life as a president, as a magistrate over our country? Because, that's something that a lot of people say, but, how true is that?
It's certainly one of the things that he, that is kind of the aura around him is, he taught Sunday school for 70 years. He's this good Christian man. And there's some real things to question there. But before we start talking about that, I think it's worth talking about his presidency, and because that is why he's well known is because of his presidency. So what successes were there in his presidency?
The majority of us at this table either were not alive or were barely alive during his presidency. So
I was 5.
The antecedents
I was
to
a
that,
little older than 5.
the details of exactly of how he became president and the alternatives that people had to vote for. I mean, Dan, can you help us out here?
So it is important to understand what was going on in the country, right? Because you have the Republicans, and the Republicans in 74, they just got swept in the legislature because of the whole Watergate scandal.
Because Nixon's a Republican.
And so in 76, everybody pretty much assumed that the Democrat would win. But at this point, the Democratic Party is really fragmented. So you have one part that's kind of the Bernie Sanders of the time, which would be Mo Udall. He was kind of this really out liberal, very liberal, which is what they had nominated to run against Nixon. They were going very liberal, and the people didn't like it. I mean, Nixon won by, 23.2%. I mean, he just demolished his competitor because he was this extreme socialist. And then you had the guy who was known as Governor Moonbeam, which is Jerry Brown in California.
Right.
And he's like this new age, he's like religiously wacko, right? I mean, and this is like another big segment of the Democratic Party. And then you also have the segregationalists. And so from the South, everybody that had run from the South for the presidency, and this was Wallace, he was kind of, when we talk about the tracts that are in the primaries, that was true then too. So the segregationalist tract, which is what all the Southerners were up to that point, were basically saying you have to separate the blacks from the white. Well, that was going to divide the party. It already did in I forget which election it was, but where Wallace, or not where Wallace ran.
Yeah, it was Gold. Was it Gold? What are you talking about? Not against Nixon, right? You're talking about.
Anyway, I'll just skip that part. And so there was real risk of the Democratic Party splitting, or that the Democratic Party would choose somebody that was just like so far out there that nobody could win, that you'd have third. I mean, it was just going to be a mess.
Because this is related to, people say that the parties switch positions, which, at least that's true in part, that, the idea of limited government, conservative type stuff, the Southern Democrats were in favor of that. And they're mixed in with other people, other Democrats, in other areas of the country that don't think that way so much. So there wasn't a strong ideological, push that unified the party.
Right, because you have the Blue Dog Democrats, which would be a lot more conservative, in morality and things, but at the same time they were segregationalists. And so then it's kind of like what happened in the last election. The only reason that Joe Biden was selected by the Democratic Party is they thought if anybody else selected it, the party would split. And so that's why this no-name governor from Georgia ends up becoming the presidential candidate, is because he didn't have much of a record. He was from Georgia. He wasn't a segregationalist, even though he was a Southerner, so that would still bring Southerners in, and then the Northerners wouldn't be against him. So he was really at a time where it would be very easy to elect somebody that was just completely off the rails, because a McGovern-type candidate could have won.
Right.
But he didn't end up getting the presidency. Instead, Carter did, who Carter wasn't that far out of the mainstream.
He was
most of the
nobody's
other
first
candidates
pick,
were.
I mean, he was no one's first pick, basically.
Right, because he was just kind of the unity candidate. Kind of very much like what happened with Joe Biden, where there's these people that are pushing these real wacko ideas, and then they go, well, we want the safe candidate, we'll go with Joe Biden. And that's basically what Carter was.
Except instead of being the front runner, he's the. I think he was like the original the term dark horse had just come out, and so he's like the original dark horse candidate.
And he started running for president way before anybody else did, and so he had been working it for a long time. So
there was one person before him, but
okay,
he didn't win.
Right, because there's always lots of people before him, so it depends on how you count the people that are significant.
And because you can't have two presidents.
It is interesting that
you can see Abraham Lincoln,
right, or Donald Trump.
I mean, it is interesting that one of the other candidates that got thrown out at the convention was a woman that was running on a pro-life candidacy in the Democratic Party. That was her whole platform, was pro-life. So you can just see how much the parties have changed since 76. But anyway, so that was one of the things that he really did, is where the country could have just gone completely in a different direction. He ended up being a moderating voice that caused it to go in much more of the same direction that Nixon had been taking it in.
So, I mean, that the 70s are a weird time, and he's kind of the normal, at least he's the normal option.
And then he ended up being found to be less normal than they thought he was going to be, but he was kind of the moderate option.
Because what I read about him is that he wasn't very ideologically driven. That he didn't have a set of principles that you could necessarily anticipate what he was going to do. He had values and things, but he didn't have, he wasn't like conservative or like a strict liberal, and so he could sometimes, depending on the issue, depending on what he thought was best in that particular situation, he might end up on either side of it.
Right, and there were like these 3 divisions in the party, so sometimes he would join with different divisions so that he could actually get things passed. So, I mean, it actually, in terms of him being able to move his policies along, it actually worked pretty well.
And that's one of the things, as we talked through this, where we talked about how when people look back on Jimmy Carter, what people do when they write history is frequently they're very lazy. They'll pick things out of his, because Carter was known for being religious in a certain sense, and he was known for these different things. But like Joshua said, his religion really didn't shape. It wasn't like all of his values were shaped by religion, because he'll make state. We'll talk about it later.
Very explicit.
He would
about
say,
that
"I
would
will
not
not let
the
my
case."
religion shape things." And so, it's very easy to look back at him and cast this idea of him, because in the end, what he really was, almost in a lot of ways, was he was a political creature. He was a political creature who looked like he wasn't going to be one, but he was one.
But he was, if you look at Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton was kind of the same way, right? He was a chameleon that just kind of fit the times, so that he was against workfare, right? That you could only receive welfare if you were able-bodied for a certain period of time where you had to start working. But he was against that until he was for that. I mean, he was very much a chameleon that he just matched the times. Well, Hillary's like, no, this is what I stand for. And so Carter's much more like Clinton in that way, that he just kind of molded himself to the situation.
But people thought of Clinton as a political creature, whereas when you look at Carter, their language about him was, there was this idea, when you look at the way they talk about him, the idea was that he was not, but he was.
Well, but I mean, it might also depend on, the way you look at it too. I'm no Carter expert, but I
You listen to a quarter of a book.
I am a Carter expert.
Unlike everyone else here, I'm not a Carter expert. But But like one of the things, I mean, he was pretty big, at least in his staff, on saying, "I'm never going to do things for political reasons. I'm always going to do what I think is right." And so, and the aides would tell each other, "If you want to get your proposal to be shut down, tell him it'll help him get reelected." Now, did he ever do things for political reasons? Well, probably. And
absolutely.
Yeah, but there are certain figures out there who they aren't out for their own political advancement, but they don't have a consistent, ideology that they're working from. So what they do can be kind of random and from other perspectives. Like if you have strict, like if you're saying you need to strictly follow whatever your idea, follow the Constitution or something, and the president is just deciding pragmatically what do I think is going to work. Sometimes you might say, well, we need to limit this area of government because it's causing problems, or we need to expand the government. And if you're looking at it from this opinion of we need to strict government, or we need to the government needs to help everyone, it can look inconsistent at times.
I think there's a part of it where what I'm not accusing him of is being like where he's like Clinton. Clinton would do whatever he needed to get power, or Clinton would do whatever. I'm not saying that Carter's motivation was just to get power. What I'm saying is Carter could find a way to get, even though his goal wasn't necessarily to I'm just going to get power. He could find a way to get himself into a position that, based on things he had said he believed in, and even that he would hold, he very adamantly personally believed in, he could still find a way to get himself there politically, and could use those, and could see how to use the politics of other people to accomplish things that he thought were worth doing. And so I'm not accusing him of being selfish or in a certain way, or like it's the same way that you would see power hungry. But he was very free to change what he held as ideals, and that's the nature of politics.
And there's different. I mean, kind of an overarching thing when you look at any person like this, or any person, is that there's different ways that you can look at people, and different vices and virtues that people can have. You could look at him and say, well, here's a horrible thing he did, so we should just reject him because he was a horrible person, and why would we, why would he have anything good with him? But, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, there's different parts of people. Everyone has mistakes. Some people are more categorized by mistakes than they are virtues, and some people the other way around. And so you can look at someone and say, they are unprincipled in this way, but maybe they are not seeking for, they're not power hungry. They're not trying to do things just to get reelected. Other people, they are strict. They have good values. They're sticking closely to them, but, they also will lie to advance that. And so you have a bunch of different, things that people can be right on. And you don't have to say that someone has nothing right just because they do things wrong, or the other way around.
Right, and I would say that he was like Clinton in terms of not having this fixed political agenda that he was driving towards. But he was very unlike Clinton in his personal integrity. I mean, he believed very strongly in telling the truth, and I'm not saying he never lied, but I'm saying compared to the modern presidents that came after him, he lied a lot less than they did, and had a lot more of a sense of, I'm not going to deceive you, I'm not going to mislead you. And I mean, he was even very blunt about things that were very foolish for him to be blunt about. That actually is probably the main thing that cost him re-election. And so yeah, he definitely had this view that because of his association with the church and stuff, that he should have a level of integrity and honesty that most politicians don't have.
I mean, because that's what when he gets elected. I mean, that's one of his big campaign things is, I'll never lie to you. If you ever hear me lie, don't vote for me, which is in contrast, to basically the anti-Nixon. I'm honest,
right,
and you can trust me. And he's not, and he's more known for being too honest than for his lies.
Right, and I think that's very true. And I think it would be good if we had some politicians that had that idea today that you shouldn't lie, and the American people to hold people accountable, because Nixon's lies in a lot of ways are a lot more minor than what President Biden's and President Trump's have been. I mean, they're both don't seem to have much hesitation about lying at all. You can even put Obama in that list.
So for whatever reason, there were good things that President Carter did during his presidency. I mean, like you said, there were some people who said even just being a concession president is something he's given credit for, was being able to unify a very fractious Democratic Party and bring some form of leadership to that. I mean,
right. And as Joshua was saying, he's like the original dark horse candidate that won. I mean, it's pretty pretty amazing that, and again, it shows his political skill that he was able to do that. But it really helped the country at a time where things could have gone very badly.
So what were some of the other things that he did that were good?
Probably the main thing that affects us on a regular basis is deregulation of the airlines. And what's interesting is you look at things that presidents do, and a lot of times, you look at their big objectives and you go, oh, look, is this good or bad? Is, Obamacare good or bad? Those type things. And a lot of the things that presidents do can be like pretty minor things relative that have a huge impact. At the point in time when he deregulated the airline industry, prices fell like by 2/3 immediately. And the convenience of it went up, and the whole hub system was set up. I mean, people complain about seat pitch and how it's narrow, but that's what people are willing to pay for. Before, you didn't have any choice. You paid. And so almost nobody flew. The airline industry, the idea that most Americans fly now, that's only because of Carter. And that's because Carter deregulated the airline industry. And it was kind of a side thing. I mean, he was trying to get the economy started. He was trying to deal with economic pressures. He was trying, he deregulated the oil industry. Before that, they would tell you what you could charge for a gallon of gas. It was not, everybody didn't set their own prices. And same with trucking, that all the trucking freight rates, you had to buy a license to truck from one point to another point. And if you didn't have a license, you weren't allowed to do it, which caused fixed prices for everything. And so he went in and changed these things. And our modern economy with all the transportation, with Amazon and all this other stuff, a lot of this goes back to what Jimmy Carter did.
I know you've talked about, on this podcast even, we've talked about Reagan, and you think of all of the big things that Reagan's remembered for, but you think about the damage that he did by signing a no-fault divorce law. Relatively, historically, people might say, oh, that's a minor thing. But it's one of the biggest lasting impacts from his presidency. And
well, that was from his governorship, but yes.
Sure. But, here, of all the things people are going to talk about with Carter, this is probably not high on the list. And yet, if you're getting on an airplane, it's pretty important.
I mean, what we think of as Americans as having of being capitalist, we would not be in the position of thinking of ourselves in capitalists the same way as we do. Even though America, we need to do an episode about capitalism and talk about it. But when you look at like even Reagan, where you're bringing up in the period during Reagan's time, I mean, he was laying the groundwork for that period of capitalism with that deregulation.
Right, because Reagan continued it, so they actually were fully deregulated under Reagan because there were some years for transition.
Right.
So Reagan gets credit for it, but it was Carter that did it.
Right. And so, I mean, when you think about the idea of the government setting the price of gas, the government setting the price of trucking, we just recently talked about how healthcare is basically run that way, and we look at that as a bad thing. But if Carter hadn't done this, I mean, the economy could be in a much, much, much worse state than it is even now.
I mean, the idea of a Democrat deregulating something.
Right.
It's pretty.
I mean, it's funny when you look at it. I mean, one of the things that probably one of the biggest things that Trump did was spending time. I mean, he made a focus on requiring deregulation. For every new regulation they want to add, they have to remove 2 or 3 or something like that. I mean, it's interesting when you look at parallels between presidents that you wouldn't think would have parallels.
And a lot of these things go back a long time that they've been gone from our economy so long that we forget about it. But I mean, FDR regulated everything. He regulated wages. Nixon wanted to regulate salaries. I mean, he made it illegal to give people raises. I mean,
again, Democrat, Republican that you're comparing there, right? I mean,
but both of them were doing it, and everybody wanted this huge government. And Carter comes along and says, we're not going to get more oil in this country unless we deregulate. And, it's kind of the opposite of what Biden's doing in a lot of ways, is he's making it harder and harder for people to produce oil. But it was Carter that was saying our oil prices are continue to go through the roof. We're going to have this embargo. We're going to be enslaved to the Middle East until we allow people to drill for oil. Which, and not so what they can receive for it.
So, and he's not doing it as much, it seems, for saying this is the right thing to do, to give people the liberty to, have businesses and to pump oil and things like that. He's doing it as a pragmatic thing to say, we have a problem, how can I fix the problem?
Right. He's saying the economy is slow, I need to speed up the economy.
Which is a better perspective than saying, I know how, the green future that we need, so I'm going to just force you into that no matter how much suffering it causes.
Another one of the good things he did is something we talked about recently on an episode where we were talking about the budget. We were talking about the debt limit battle that was been going on and the arguments over that is Carter pushed for zero-based budgeting, where he said, there's within government, what they do is they build in within budgeting that this year we're going to borrow this amount of money, next year we're going to borrow a greater amount of money. So there's already a built into the process an increase in the amount of debt that the government's going to accrue.
Well, increase in the amount of spending. This is really the
Right.
spending
Well,
side.
but in the end, because you're already doing deficit spending, they're already planning to borrow more money in one sense. And so there's just this natural, even without them increasing anything by their nature, if they just let their planning run its course, there's already an increase that's going to go on. And Carter said, hey, we actually need to go back and we need to reset things. We need to say there are no pre-existing things that we have to spend money on. We need to bring it back to zero. Even when you're talking about Social Security, even when you're talking about any of the other government programs, we need to consider every single one of those to be a spending initiative. Do we have the money to spend it? And are we willing to spend the political capital to actually say we must spend money on this?
And today that's considered the extreme Republican view.
Right.
That's kind of what's being proposed, and that's what Biden was lobbing pot shots against in his most recent State of the Union.
And was saying, I don't believe for a minute that all the Republicans, I don't even think that the majority of Republicans want this ridiculous sort of idea. It's just a couple of you, and I'm not even going to call them out because we would probably all just shoot them, And he didn't say the part about shooting them, but it was
implied.
The idea was
Actually, what was implied is I want to paint it so that all of you are guilty. If I name somebody,
Right.
then all the rest of you go free.
right. But it's so ridiculous that we can't even contemplate this.
And this is what Carter was proposing, and I think properly proposing, is
Right.
that you don't go and say, well, next year Health and Human Services, we're going to automatically have a budget increase of 3%. You go, what should we spend on? What can we get rid of? What should be allocated? How do you start and build out your budget?
Right. The idea that the servants of the American people should automatically plan to spend more money and to use more of the American people's money is a ridiculous notion, but this is where we are.
But when you're a bureaucracy rather than a republic, that's what you can expect. So, which another
Tune into a
podcast we
future
need to-
episode. Yeah.
But the reason the Camp David Accords are important is because after Egypt loses the 7 Days War, Israel has Egyptian territory. And now when we think of the war, we think of, Saudi Arabia funding the Palestinians and Jordan funding the Palestinians and stuff. But the biggest
now or when
now,
okay.
now. But at that point in time, the biggest funder, the one that was bearing almost all the burden of driving Israel out of the Middle East, was Egypt. But they also lost territory in the war because they attacked and they lost.
And they lost spectacularly, right?
They lost
In 7
spectacularly
days.
right. in 7 days. And so basically what Carter did, and my guess is he didn't even have that much to do with it directly, other than what he did is he brought the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Egypt together at Camp David. And he mediated the discussion. But I think he didn't have that forceful of a presence, so they probably more discussed it themselves because Egypt really wanted to get out. And Israel was happy to give them back the Egyptian territory. They didn't really want the Egyptian territory if they thought they'd have real peace. So the Camp David Accords were that agreement to say, we'll give you back the land that we conquered, and you agree that you change your position, that your position is not that Israel needs to be driven out of the Middle East. And so this is a really significant deal because this is the biggest player in the Middle East at the time, although Egypt isn't technically in the Middle East, but they were the biggest Arab player. And so the fact that they would back off, it's kind of like when President Trump was negotiating it, trying to get Saudi Arabia, because then Saudi Arabia became the biggest funder of it afterwards.
Right.
But getting Egypt off the table, that was a big deal. And you don't get the Abraham Accords that President Trump did when he was in office without first getting the Camp David Accords. And that really reduced the amount of war and stuff in the Middle East. So it was a really significant thing.
Because everybody else who was funding it was either funding it sort of indirect. I mean, it became much less of this country is directly at war with Israel as opposed to they're funding groups that are at war, that are sort of at war with Israel, which starts to be a really significant change.
And I did skip over this section of the book I was listening to. So, I know even less about this. But I did hear that he was one of the, I guess, one of the few 20th century presidents not to send troops into a new country or not to start a war, pseudo war with someone. And
I was thinking this afternoon and trying to remember if he started a war. I don't know of any.
Because I think he was
started.
quite anti-war and saying we need to negotiate and not go to war with people.
And the tenor of the nation at that time was very much, they were sick of Vietnam, so there was. It really fit where the nation was. The nation was, we don't want to go into war against anything.
And then even after he's president, isn't he still trying to do that?
That was
to say.
Yeah, that was his legacy. His legacy almost strictly was in these peace negotiations. So when you look at the reason all these countries are calling him in to do peace negotiations and things, really it all comes back to the Camp David Accords. That was really how he got his name. And that was the thing that certainly worldwide had the biggest impact because people were pretty shocked that Egypt and Israel came to an agreement.
And it really helped that Egypt lost spectacularly.
Sure, and that's what I said. I'm not sure how much Carter did more than facilitate it, but still facilitating it's an important thing because of the United States reputation. Egypt, the president of Egypt would come here, the prime minister of Israel would come here, and they'd sit down and talk to each other.
And even when we're going to talk about some of the negatives of him, there's a part of it where some of his negatives, like you said, there could have been presidents who would have gotten in the way of peace between them. There could have been presidents who would have been more, you know what I mean, who would have
could have pushed both sides and forced to a specific agreement. Instead, the two sides mostly came into agreement, and it's held ever since. I mean, they're really Egypt. You don't think of Egypt just on the borderline of that they could go to war with Israel at any time. Right. I mean, it really was a major shift in Middle East policy or the Middle East situation.
Yes.
So let's talk about some of his negatives. And some of his negatives were based on where he was, in history. Because, again, you have Nixon, and Nixon was very much despised, and Nixon had a certain reputation, and so
the most popular despised president.
Right. I mean, it was incredible how the media manipulated stuff to get things that let's be serious. Obama, we know for a fact, President Obama, that he used the IRS, and the main charge against Nixon was that he threatened his enemies with the IRS. Well, President Obama didn't threaten them. He actually sicked the IRS on them. That's a proven fact. And yet that was what Nixon really got impeached for. And so you look at it, and there was a lot of media manipulation, but at that point in time, everybody's going, Nixon is just evil. And so Carter becomes the anti-Nixon. And that's good in certain ways, like the not lying. That's a good thing. So it's not inherently wrong to be the anti-Nixon. But he was the anti-Nixon in saying basically to diminish the office. And you can think that, he would wear a sweater rather than wearing a jacket and tie. And you go, that doesn't matter much, but it actually it ends up mattering a lot. When he would go on Air Force One, he would actually carry his own bag. He refused to ride in a limousine during the inaugural parade. He walked in the inaugural parade. And so he was setting this idea of the president's just another guy. At one point, he was talking about replacing the limo with the Volkswagen Beetle. This is the kind of attitude that he wanted to express, that he wasn't like Nixon, who's trying to rule everything, but also meant that he's just a common guy, which means you can't direct the country forward because you're saying I'm just like anybody else. And so it ends up that it really diminished in the eyes of the world and in the eyes of the country, the state of the country, the view of the country, that we were going someplace, that we were driven. It became, we're just a common guy that, sits around and drinks beer and watches television.
Which, it's a fine line as well. We also want presidents that are coming from the people and that don't think they're an aristocrat, that, it was, born and destined for their office and are better than everyone else. We want someone who came from the people and then returns to the people. But there can be a point where you've taken it too far.
And it seems to me that what you want to do is say that you're a common man that has some exceptional qualities is why you can do it, as opposed to his was more, I'm just a peanut farmer. I mean, he was a nuclear engineer. He was, he was successful in a lot of things, but he downplayed all that and just went, I'm just a common peanut farmer. And so, my brother drinks beer. He had Billy Beer named after his brother. That was a brand of beer that started to sell. I mean, it was very much. And so I think he went overboard to the point that it started to actually cause the country to have a different view of itself. And that's really why Reagan ran, right? The dawning of America, the city, shining city on a hill. It's all because because Carter just kind of had this, we're just blah.
Right.
And
we're just common.
And I think another part of it, too, is his leadership failures, where he's not able to say, he's not able to put forth a vision that convinces the people that he is, leading the country in a good direction. I think when he comes into the presidency, there's this energy crisis where gas is expensive and, energy is expensive. And he's like, well, this is going to last a really long time. Just start turning off the lights. Well, that's not a very encouraging message. I mean, you don't want a president that's promising things that he can't do, but he just didn't have, he wasn't able to lead in a way that
he wasn't
inspired
inspirational,
people. Yeah.
And
that combines with he also wasn't very particularly good at getting a leading Congress either and getting them to pass the things he wanted them to pass. I mean, he was one of the few presidents in recent history to have 4 years with his party controlling both houses of Congress. So he did get a lot of things passed, but not a lot of the big things he wanted to pass. His tax reform, his welfare reform, he didn't get those passed because he just, he personally didn't have the, on the campaign trail things, he had personal skills to be able to connect with people, but he just did not care for, engaging with Congress and talking to people he needed to talk to and getting them on board with his proposals to actually get things done.
And the Democratic Party had these big camps that were very opposed to each other. So, and while he got them to unite to elect him, he couldn't get them to unite in a public vision, to have a consistent vision, so that he couldn't drive people to vote for it.
Yeah, but some of it were like, the head of whatever one of the top Senate committee was like, yeah, you can't get me to support your stuff if you don't invite me to the White House to talk about it. The fact that you call me and lecture me on what you want me to do, it's not how it works. I have power too. You need to respect me. So, when he doesn't do things like that, that hurts him even beyond the ideological divisions. At a personal level, he was failing to get things done.
And all the congressmen, they all, they address each other as, the honorable member from so-and-so. And they have a certain decorum. They have to wear a suit. They have to wear a tie. And all of a sudden he comes in and he's the cardigan president. And so just even that, they saw him as diminishing their role by the way that he diminished the view of the presidency and the style of the presidency. And so that had and like you said, he wouldn't invite people over. Well, there's certain things that there's protocols, and those protocols matter, and you just want to reject all those and go, those are just about being an aristocrat, instead of going, no, that's showing honor to the office and not just the person.
I think there's a part of it where we've kind of lost, because when you're talking about diminishing the role, when you're talking about leadership, and you're talking about inspiration, I mean, we've lost the connection between those things. There's just part of it where, you can look at somebody they're in a limousine and you go, oh, they just think of themselves as an aristocrat. And there's just part of it where, a lot of times the reason why men in business got limousines is because they were going to do business while they traveled. They were going to and there's this part where you imagine them like in the back living in luxury and they're just drinking and laughing. But I remember as a kid watching, Sabrina, where you've got the story of the billionaire played by Bogart. And Bogart's sitting in the back and he's on the phone selling stock and trading stock in the back of because he's driven. And I've met people who were like that, who they're always on. They're always thinking about what's next. They're working on it. If they're going to go on a 2-hour drive, on that 2-hour drive, they want to get something accomplished. They want to have this guy ride with me, have this guy ride. I want to make a connection between these two people. I want to move this forward. And that's the kind of people who usually become president. Typically, the person who's a president, they're driven like that. And when we think about even the word inspiration, it means to put your spirit in someone else. And so there's this part of it where you breathe the breath that's in you into the nation. You say, here's where we're going. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to accomplish. And like you said, you don't want rhetoric that doesn't mean anything. You don't want lies, but you do want somebody who believes you're going somewhere and has a place to go that's worth going. And that's what you're really saying he failed at.
And some of it too is just having the ability to lead people. Because, there's even the things that he did that reflected poorly. Well, someone else may have been able to do that, like a Teddy Roosevelt, who just had like a larger-than-life personality and be able to say, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm doing it. And people say, yeah, that makes sense. And,
right.
You're going to walk in your inaugural parade. You're going to not ride in a limo, and we understand why you're doing it. And you're going to inspire us, and that even if that comes through to people you don't see personally. I mean, like when he walked into a room, he was like the center of attention just because he had that big of a personality.
Right.
And so some of the things, depending on the person, they might be able to pull it off, and other people can't pull it off.
But he was, in everything he was doing, he was explaining exactly why he was doing it, and it was, I'm making myself small.
Right.
That was his
That's
agenda,
the spirit
which
he
is
put into
that's the
people.
spirit that he was pushing, and it was very deliberate and very intentional. And let's be serious. He probably has 20 suitcases with him when he goes, on a trip for 2 weeks, but he still carries one garment bag onto Air Force One. He's doing it. It's all a show. It's deliberate, and I think he sent the message that he said he was going to send, and it was also the message that people said they wanted. They were just wrong.
But it depends too. Like one of the big things about generals, the good generals, that when they pass like this cannon that's stuck, they'll get out and help push the cannon. Maybe they are carrying their bag, they're sleeping in a tent the same as the men. Well, they're not doing that to say I'm not a great general. They're doing that to associate themselves with the people. And if they're a good leader, they're able to pull it off where they're not diminishing themselves.
Well, Carter was intentionally trying to say Nixon was a big personality. Nixon was driving things. He was like actually changing things. And the country is tired of that because of the scandal. And so we just want calm and peace and nothing major to happen. And so he was trying to lead in that. And that was the tenor that he was bringing to the American people. And so I think he led the way that he wanted to. It just caused real problems because he didn't realize what the cost would be. And there was a huge cost. It creates he did his malaise speech, which is the speech that people basically go, well, that's when he lost the presidency, because he couldn't cast a vision of how to fix everything. It was just, hey, unemployment's high, inflation's high, we're in a malaise. Oh, well, there's not much we can do. Right. You'll just have to suck it up.
Leadership is not telling people where you are.
Right.
Unless your point is to let them understand where they are so you can move them, right?
Right, and the problem with it was that he didn't have any great vision, or he had already diminished intentionally, and I'm not even saying that this wasn't a leadership thing. He just thought that this was the leadership that would work, was to lead, to go, yeah, we're going to diminish everything and not make it so we're so prominent like we were under Nixon. And it just had real effects on the economy, like huge effects on the economy. Because so much of our economy is driven by people's attitude. If you think that next year the economy is going to get bad, you start saving more, you spend less, and then all of a sudden people can sell fewer goods. And you get into the cycle that the attitude of people of what the economy is going to be like in 3 months causes the economy to change in 3 months. And so he basically was telegraphing, hey, there's not much we can do, which causes the economy just to get worse, significantly worse.
And I think there's a part of it where people will go, they wrongly do this. They look at Christ, who says that he came in the form of a servant and he led as a servant, and they go that Carter was trying to be like Christ. Christ did not diminish the nature of being a servant. Christ,
exalted the nature of being a servant.
And that's, yeah. And I think that's real. And there's this part of it where a good leader, even when there are times where you have to make sure that people understand how you're serving. There are times where they need, and that's part of your roles. But there are times where, like, when we're on a project, you're like, the best thing I can do is go in there and get heads down and work on moving this code forward, because I can make the biggest impact on this project that anybody else can make on it. And you going, I'm going to go do this, or I'm going to go, that would be an absolute waste of time, because in the end, that is how you are serving. And there's this part of it where it's really easy to conflate things. We did an episode on pride where we talked about there's just this you can have a false idea of pride where you create this fake humility, this affectation of humility. And that's my issue with Carter, is a lot of the things that he was modeling was sort of this fake version of humility, because he didn't have somewhere to really lead people. So the best he could do was just be really good at being small.
And, this will sound weird, but in ways, Nixon had certain attitude might be the right word, of Christ, because what he said is, I'm going to boldly serve. Only he added illegality to it. What
Right.
Carter said is, I'm not going to boldly serve, but I'm going to be very legal. What you actually want is somebody that will boldly serve in legal means, which is exactly what Christ did. Because that's, and so instead he's going, humility is not doing anything and not leading and not setting a direction, rather than going, no, that's what the presidency's about.
Though to be clear, the laws you're talking about are not the enumerated powers of Congress in the Constitution.
I
Those are
agree.
not the laws that Carter was following.
I mean, if you think about this from just an analogy of if you're a father and your attitude towards your children and your wife in your household was, hey, I'm just a guy, I'm just one of you, then, I mean, that does nothing for your sons and daughters to give them confidence of, oh, I need to follow this person. This person's going to protect me. This person knows where our family's going. He's just another one of us. And
Right.
what are we doing?
Instead of what leadership is, like in the father example, is you go, this is, to your sons, this is what I'm training you to be. This is where I'm leading you to, is I'm going to go out in front so that you follow and that you go further than I do when you're my age. And that was like the opposite of what Carter did. He just kind of said, yeah, I'm one of the guys.
And one of the legacies of Carter is parents as being the best friend of your children. I mean, that's what you're talking when you're like. I mean, that's what you're kind of saying. If you say I'm just like you, it's just be your child's best friend, be somebody who they can talk to and they can hang out with and they're comfortable with. And there are things that aren't horrible about that relationship. It's better to have that parent than to have no parent. It's better to have that, but But that's not leadership. That's not what you were called to be with your child. That's not what God's led. That's not what God's designed.
And so where this leads is, because he's, I was reading a post that some homosexual put up about how he was the first president that didn't have like this masculine aura about him, that he was, and obviously this guy being a homosexual that, hates the idea of masculinity, that he was saying, that's toxic inherently. But Carter didn't project strength. He projected weakness. And when you project weakness on the national stage, it's really dangerous. And so the Iran hostage crisis, that was really directly related to his style of the presidency. And so it really had some cost. And it caused the fall of Iran. It caused the hostages to be taken captive from the embassy. It was a pretty big deal.
Tell us more for those of us who don't know about that.
Basically what happens is, this is where you get the Shah of Iran falls and you get the radical Islam that's in Iran now. That was all really driven because the U.S. was the one that propped up the Shah of Iran. We were the ones that were putting him there. He could only be in office with us. But everybody saw Jimmy Carter as weak and that he wouldn't do anything. And so then our embassy gets taken over and there's hostages. I forget how many, but for like 400 days they were hostages. And the U.S. went, we can't do anything to rescue them. They ended up sending in helicopters and special forces to rescue them. The helicopters got sand in the engines and they all died. And the special forces, some of them escaped. I think some died. It was just like a total mess. And, you look at what happened at the leaving Afghanistan. You look at what happened at the leaving of Vietnam. The Iran hostage crisis, which on the same level that internationally it made us look like our military was completely incompetent. And so because of that, when Reagan runs on, I'm going to rebuild the military, that's the whole thing. And you can even see the level of how much that was in the view of Carter is because once Reagan was elected, I think it was just a few days before he was inaugurated, that they were afraid of what Reagan was going to do, so they released the hostages. And so it was very much his style of presidency that caused the hostage crisis in the first place.
Kind of like when Biden gets elected, more illegal immigrants start coming. I think even before he was inaugurated, they already start coming. So like, okay, it's open season now, just because not even because of the policies, but just because of the attitude.
Right, and you have January 6th, and you see that Trump is getting impeached again, and so they go, yeah, this is going to be free game. Nobody's going to stop us, and the illegal immigration skyrockets, and it's the same thing that happens there. The attitude of a president and how they're viewed by the world has real long-term consequences.
Which it was interesting because in some of the because I did get to like the beginning of the hostage or the fall of Iran or Iran, whichever. Iran. The fall. I did get to the fall of Iran, and and some of the things that Carter was saying was like, hey, we've been meddling in the Middle East for a long time, and this is a consequence of that. Which is kind of like some of the stuff we've said before. It's like there are consequences for when you meddle, and he's saying I'm not gonna go to war to prop him up. But then the fact that you look at the Muslims think you're weak, then they're not going to say, well, if we take hostages, he might say, well, that's an act of war against us. We're going to attack you. They're going to think that he's a pushover. So you could even say like, hey, I'm not going to prop up Iran, but also have the persona and the strength, project the strength to make there not be the same consequences.
Right. You can say you recognize that the U.S. Embassy is U.S. territory and we'll defend our territory. But nobody believed him. And I mean, it took him over a year before he did anything, that he even tried to do anything, I believe, if I remember my timeline correctly. And so he just had this attitude, and it was a very dangerous attitude. And then recognize that all of this sets up Reagan, because Reagan comes in going, we need to rebuild the military. He's going, I will not walk into the Oval Office without a suit and tie on, because otherwise it's just showing disrespect to the presidency. It has nothing to do with me. It's disrespect to the presidency. I will never walk into the Oval Office without a suit and tie. And so he's running on these things because the world's looking and going, I mean, the United States is looking and going, hey, Carter, these are not good policies. They sounded good for him to be the anti-Nixon, but then we see what the anti-Nixon is and go, we don't really want that.
And the issue is it caused Reagan to be an anti-Carter to some extent, to an extreme. I mean, there were some negatives with what Reagan did in the sense of reversing Carter's position. I mean, whereas if you look at some of our military spending, you look at some of the things that we've gotten into over time and our positions that we've taken, some of the things we've talked about, even with the way we've kind of projected force around the world, some of those were a overcorrection from Carter's problems, because in the end there was this absence that he had created. I can see by your face you don't agree with that.
Yeah, because I mean, when Reagan comes in and he builds up the military, he actually causes the Soviet Union to fall. So it's kind of hard for me to see that. Now, it was really George Herbert Walker Bush, who wanted to keep all the military, right? The ex-CIA guy. I mean, he wanted to keep all these forces all over the world.
Sure.
And so he was the one that was making those decisions post the fall of the Soviet Union.
So, I mean, I guess I should say then that it's not necessarily that Reagan took it too far, but there was this aspect of the idea of the anti-Carter. If you take that to its logical extreme, it ends up getting us to where we end up being someone that's not just saying we're going to defend our position. It's someone who's saying we're going to extend ourselves into the world. And maybe Reagan didn't take it too far.
We've been doing that since World War II. I mean, you have Korean War, Vietnam War. I mean, those are huge. I mean, we've pulled back massively since Vietnam War. I'm just saying there's this part of it where whenever you pull back too far one way, it's very common for you to swing back in the direction in the other way. I mean, it's really easy. The opposite of someone frequently isn't the right place to be.
Right. I think the legacy that he's remembered for the most is just how much damage he did to the economy. Because it was, the other thing that Reagan ran on was the misery index, which was the unemployment number plus the inflation. And I think when he came into office, inflation was under 6%. When he left office, it was like 14.8%. And that was that's a pretty significant hit on what was happening to the American pocketbook. And so that causes real problems.
The Reagan quote I remember is, a recession is when your neighbor loses your job. Depression is when you lose your job. And recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his job.
Now, what Reagan didn't go is it's going to get 2% worse for unemployment, that it's going to go from 7.8 to 10.1 or something like that before it got better. But when Reagan comes in, he's able to run on that because, I go to Nigeria, and you see in Nigeria 30% inflation in a year isn't unusual. Well, that is incredibly destructive economically. And you look at what was happening with the 14.8% or whatever it was. It wasn't that high, 14.1 or something. That when Carter was in office, I mean, that's really destructive. that really undermines your economy. That undermines your ability to do any new things. That just really destroys your economy. And it's all from publishing money, as we've talked about many times before.
And it's one of those things where you always where the president gets too much credit. I mean, for all the Donald Trump fans listening, I mean, of course he's not responsible, for the employment going horrible at the end of his presidency. I mean, we could not to get into the details. I mean, he bears a little blame, but COVID and all the states' response to COVID has a big part of that.
Which he pushed them to do.
Right, sure. But he bears a portion of it. Carter, if there hadn't been inflation in the years leading up to him, if we hadn't gone off the gold standard, because I think Nixon ended the gold standard, and so that of course plays into it. And so he's in there for 4 years, and he contributes to it. He inherits a situation that's headed in the wrong direction. So it's one of those things where you get credit for what the numbers are from when your presidency starts to when your presidency ends, no matter what percentage of that blame you deserve.
Right, but if you look during the Nixon presidency, it was running 4 to 5%. Maybe it could get up to 6% inflation, and then Carter, it goes up. I mean, it is distinct. You can see that it's Carter's policies that were different, and I don't think it was just the kicking in of some of the poor policies of Nixon. I mean, that's where you got the 6%. He was able to take it from 6% to 14%. That's pretty bad.
I mean, it's sort of like the opposite. When Donald Trump took over from Obama, I mean, there was a sudden shift in the economy. I mean, it was like from the election,
Yeah, a huge part of it was, like when we talked about how with President Biden that all of a sudden a bunch of illegals started to come over the border. Well, the stock market started to go up as soon as Trump was elected. It didn't wait for him to get into office, and it went up consistently the whole time until COVID.
Right. And let's be clear, he does have some real. I mean, the vision that Donald Trump cast for the nation during coronavirus, it was bad leadership. I mean, it was a lot of times it was absentee leadership or in the opposite direction of what it should have been.
Though he couldn't have turned that around completely. He could have helped a little bit, but
he could have helped a lot.
Even when he backed off, people were still pushing it. Backed off, some people doubled down.
I know, but I'm just saying if he had
but if he would have stood his ground at the beginning, it wouldn't have gotten nearly where it did. It was that he caved to begin with is the problem. It was there was political movement to try to destroy him and destroy his presidency. So they make something bigger than in previous presidencies. They wouldn't have made it as big. And he misplayed it. He mishandled it. So I don't see how you get around that.
Well, no, I agree. Disastrous. He definitely bears blame, but he shares it liberally.
I think there's lots of governors that share a lot of the blame as well. Oh, another thing that has really caused incredibly negative consequences, right? And this is what I think 2024, one of the big things that will be in the election in 2024, I would guess, based on what it was in 2022, is the education policies in this country. And the education policies in this country, until Carter, were pretty much set at the state and local level. With Carter, he splits off the Department of Education from Education, Health, and Human Services, and he gives it a lot more power, a lot more control over budget, a lot more of the funding from public schools comes from the federal government. And that's how you get all these things in the school that are the critical race theory, all this stuff. It comes from the Department of Education and the power the Department of Education has. And it was Jimmy Carter that created the Department of Education.
I mean, because he was very progressive, now progressive.
Not very compared to some of the people he was running against.
No, compared to truth, I mean, he was he was quite progressive. He was, pro-feminism, pro-civil rights, which in some ways could be good, but beyond what's good, and so he pro-big government. So he's not some sort of he reformed certain things, but his reforms were not all good ideas.
Right, and so I mean, people talk about and compare President Biden's presidency to Jimmy Carter, and it's a pretty fair comparison. There's a lot of similarities. He's kind of the consensus candidate that he'll just be a caretaker. He won't be doing anything bold. And then at the same time, they're very progressive, so they rule a lot more progressively than what they run on. Right?
Except that Biden arguably doesn't have most of the good parts, like being honest,
right?
Considering cutting any government spending,
or government control. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Eliminate all the good parts, unfortunately.
We're all feeling like hostages.
The American hostage situation.
What's inflation doing these days?
Yeah, just remember, could be 14.1% inflation.
What would the price
Bad
of eggs,
policies.
What would the price of eggs be then? You couldn't even afford to go egg a government office.
You're staking a government office. All of a
Bacon is
sudden,
$3 a pound at Sam's Club right now.
Stakeout becomes a whole different term, a different meaning.
One of the things that I often hear talking about the legacy and the presidency of Jimmy Carter was he was an evangelical. He used terms like born again. He's a Baptist. He's a Southern Baptist. He's a Sunday school teacher. And I mean, surely that has some impact on us today.
I mean, just to start on that, he was, I think, definitely one of the most pious presidents of the 20th century. He is one that is praying a lot, is a deacon in a church, teaching Sunday school for all these years, actually attending church, versus a lot of modern presidents, using modern in a very broad sense, haven't done those types of things at all.
And his Christianity doesn't appear to be for show. It doesn't appear to be a political tool in the sense that other presidents.
Right. I mean, it definitely helped him politically, but it is the type of thing that even at 90 some, he's still teaching Sunday school when it's not helping him politically at 90.
I mean, and I think when you get into this and you look at it, it's so interesting because he's known for this. It's talked about when you look for him. There's articles all about it, and then he is very clear that he was going. One of his principles and things that he held to was his religious beliefs would not influence his decisions as president, would not influence policy decisions. And so, I mean, there's this part of it where on one hand, he's got this external pious nature. He's a member. He's probably the most visible Protestant president, in the sense of all those things
of the 20th century.
Of the 20th century, and his religious views he's saying, I hold these things dearly, and they have nothing to do with the moral nature of what I'm going to do as a president.
But he's saying that holding to a standard Southern Baptist doctrine. So he's not saying that I'm going to go against Protestant doctrine. He's going the Baptist doctrine. The key Baptist doctrine is that the church has nothing to do with the state, that it's completely independent of one another. So he's not saying, we have to recognize when he's saying that, he's also saying exactly what the Southern Baptists were teaching at the time. It's not something that he's going off the rails. He's going to what was considered orthodoxy for the Southern Baptists.
He's meeting with his pastor, and his pastor isn't telling him you're supporting X, Y, and Z. If you're a Christian, you can't do that. His pastor is saying you're doing a great job.
Right. Doesn't matter that you say that the only time that a woman should ever be allowed to have an abortion is in the case of rape, incest, in the life of the mother, right? That was his position. But he said, that's my religious view. I cannot allow that to affect public policy, separation of church and state. The two are to be completely separate. So I will vote for things where the murder of babies is on the table because, hey, I don't want my religion to affect any decisions that I make. And so he had this view of the separation of church and state that was very dangerous and very damaging because it's just biblically a completely false view. You read Daniel 2 that says that the church of Jesus Christ, the kingdom of God, is to crush all the nations of the earth. Well, that doesn't mean that you just say we're going to be completely separate. He had a very dualistic view of the church and state, which means that spiritual things and physical things are completely separate. And so it's an error in the Baptist theology.
But I mean,
it's very prominent.
Isn't that the view of the majority of evangelicals today?
I think there was a kickback against it because of Jimmy Carter saying it. Because you look at somebody like Jerry Falwell, and Jerry Falwell did not have that view at all. And Jerry Falwell comes to prominence, I think, largely because of Jimmy Carter's view of this is where evangelicals are supposed to be. And people went, so you're saying that you can think that it's wrong to murder a baby, but yet you're going to vote to allow the murder of babies. There's something fundamentally skewed here. And so I think the moral majority and all that movement, I think that all arises out of a resistance to Jimmy Carter's statement of what's the Baptist position. Even though Falwell's a Baptist, Jimmy Carter was holding to the more historical Baptist position, but Jerry Falwell was actually able to get a big group of people, not as big as Jimmy Carter got, but a big group of people to follow him because he was pushing back against that idea.
Carter's going to the point where he's like canceling things that presidents had, or as a governor or as president, presidents had done traditionally. Like prayer breakfasts, prayers with his staff, and saying this violates the separation of church and state. Even as he has more, piety than his predecessors who were doing it, yet because of his theology, saying this is wrong for me to do.
Right. He says that he's praying 30 times a day, that he's never prayed as much in his life, but he will not pray with anybody associated with government.
Though he did sometimes, but as a rule, he wouldn't. And I don't know how true it was, but the story is that he did encourage the head of China to allow Christians to have freedom of worship there. But he would only do that privately. He wouldn't say what you're doing is wrong. You need to stop publicly. Privately, he would meet with him and say, "Hey, you should do this."
But what was really interesting is that his big push on an international scale was human rights, and so he's saying that humans' rights are really important. And that's what you need to push, even though that has to have some religious basis to say that the humans have rights. So he hasn't thought some of this through, because he had to be pushing humanism or Christianity or something like that to push the idea of human rights to begin with. And that was his big push. And he made a huge shift in the public doctrine of the United States in terms of our international view of how much are we supposed to be doing what's the most convenient thing for the United States and the most beneficial to us versus pushing human rights. He made a big shift to push towards human rights.
Right. And so, you could discuss whether or not he was a Christian, but the one thing is he wasn't governing as a Christian president. I mean, he was clearly saying, I don't think he used the words, "I'm not a Christian president," but that's not how he was ruling. He didn't, we talked earlier about how he didn't have an ideology in a lot of ways. He was more pragmatic, so he definitely didn't have any ideology, let alone a Christian ideology, to say, is the way that I'm governing consistent with, God's will revealed in the scriptures.
And as well, there's an aspect of, even within his view of what morality was and what it meant. I mean, when he was running for office, people were asking him questions about this, and he ended up going and doing an interview with Playboy. I mean, and I'll kind of read. So the guy was basically asking him, are you going to do things? Are you going to pass laws, based on what you believe about morality in these cases? And this was his answers. What Christ taught about most was pride, that one person should never think he was better than anybody else. The thing that's drummed into us all the time is not to be proud, not to be better than anyone else, not to look down on people, but to make ourselves acceptable in God's eyes through our own actions and recognize the simple truth that we're saved by grace. I try not to commit a deliberate sin. I recognize that I'm going to do it anyhow because I'm human and I'm tempted. And Christ set some almost impossible standards for us. Christ said, "I tell you that anyone who looks on a woman with lust has in his heart already committed adultery." I've looked on a lot of women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times. This is something that God recognizes I will do, and I have done it, and God forgives me for it. But that doesn't mean that I condemn someone who not only looks on a woman with lust, but who leaves his wife and shacks up with somebody out of wedlock. Christ says, don't consider yourself better than someone else because one guy screws a whole bunch of women while the other guy is loyal to his wife. The guy who's loyal to his wife ought not to be condescending or proud because of the relative degree of sinfulness. I don't inject these beliefs in my answers to your secular questions, but I don't think I would ever take on the same frame of mind that Nixon or Johnson did, lying, cheating, and distorting the truth, not taking into consideration my hope for my strength of character. I think that my religious beliefs alone would prevent that from happening to me. And so there's just part of it where in the middle of there, the section where he's talking about, if you're talking about your salvation, yes, the person who looks at a woman and lusts after her should understand that he is condemned in the same way as the other man who goes out and commits adultery. That Christ is very clear. If you look at a woman in lust, you have committed a sin worthy of hell. But when you look at this in a cultural sense, and you look at this in a way where you're talking about with laws and with issues that should actually be should actually be morally dealt with. The person who goes out and cheats his wife has actually broken a covenant and a contract that should be upheld by the nation. And he's done something very different than the guy who looks at a woman and lusts after his heart. So the guy who lusts after a woman in his heart shouldn't go, I'm better than all these other men out there. But there is a part of it where the law goes, you've done something in a real way that breaks something that you should be dealt with. And Carter's kind of pretending like that's all the same in all these circumstances. And so even his piety and even his view of how God judges us and how we should hold each other accountable was really different than what Scripture teaches. And so, I mean, I think that's what I mean is it's so easy to look back and take a really shallow view of history and go, Carter was this religious guy. But people should look at him and go, what did his religion have value? What did his religion do for the world? What did he see his religion actually accomplishing? Was there any power to this? And I don't see it when I look at the things he said and the things he says he believes and how he acted.
There's a lot of things embodied in nuggets in this quote that we've talked about with his style of leadership. You know, just looking at these two different sets of sins, the sin of lust and the sin of serial adultery, and then saying that, okay, what's really at stake here is don't be proud. And that's not what's really at stake. I mean, yes, obviously, pride is a sin. Don't go commit pride as a cover for something else, as you know, but self-righteousness is not the thing that's really at stake when you are in a position of authority over the nation, and you're as a magistrate of God, you are called to discern between good and evil, and you're called to discern between degrees of good and evil.
Some you're to be an avenger of God's wrath,
right? And some things are within your responsibility as a governor to deal with, and some things aren't. Some things are purely heart things. And you're right. As a Sunday school teacher, okay, fine. Let's talk about heart things. But then as a ruler of a nation, you do bear the sword.
And you know, I mean, he's recognizing that there's relative degrees of sinfulness, but he just undercuts that he just brings that all down and says it doesn't apply to the state at all. And I'm not sure what standard we're supposed to be using for our laws if we're not adopting any moral standard.
But remember, this is the man who spent, all the years after his presidency, and how many years was that? That was, 40 odd years after his presidency, pushing the idea of human rights. But yet in this quote, he was asked the question, are you going to prosecute adultery? And what he's saying here is, I will not protect wives.
Right.
I'm not going to. I would never do anything to stop the people that you're selling your magazine from pursuing their pleasure at the expense of their wife, at the expense of their children. I'm not going to stop any of it. Well, where are you protecting human rights when you won't protect some of the most basic human rights? You won't protect the covenant of marriage. In the end, that is how women and children get abused, when you don't protect the covenant of marriage.
And you could say the same thing about abortion, where he's saying, well, I support Roe versus Wade because I'm not going to impose my religious beliefs on other people. Well, now you're letting babies be killed because you say I need to have a secular
The person
standard.
who thinks about aborting a child is no different than the person who actually goes out and aborts the child.
But
that's just absolutely ridiculous.
But the hypocrisy of him being the great human rights guy that was pushing that, and the whole Carter Center and everything that he gets the Nobel Prize for, it's like he undermines it with his view. His view isn't that at all. His view is not to push human rights. His view is to reject the idea that humans have rights.
Right.
And it's very, very, very destructive. What he's saying here is that we're just going to equate all sin, so it really doesn't matter what you do. Because he quotes adultery because he's talking to Playboy, but he could have also said, well, I've gotten angry before, so we should let murderers go.
Right.
Because if you follow that logic is we must not do anything to murderers.
Right.
But yet he's still held to do things
Thinking
to
about
murderers.
stealing
So he
just
was
as
against
bad
the
as
death
stealing.
penalty.
He was against the death penalty.
Eventually.
Shouldn't do anything to murderers because, hey, I've been angry and I've murdered in my heart. And
Right.
so I'm
Exactly.
not going to think that I'm any better than the person who goes out and murders his neighborhood.
Because you
Otherwise, it
shouldn't be
just
proud
makes
about
me proud.
Proud of your relative
If
degree
we
of
actually
sinfulness.
we have a judicial hearing and a court case and we judge somebody for having committed murder, it just means all the jurors were proud. If you were if you were logical and you're and consistent in your thinking, he really had no understanding of human rights at all.
And it's really interesting when you look. So he does this interview, and afterwards you can go back and read articles from the New York Times from that time period about the people's reaction to the interview. And there's some people say he was really upset because of kind of what he said about lusting after people. But a lot of people, you read it and they were upset that they were surprised that he did an interview for Playboy. I mean, why does this person who's pious and doing all these things, why does he go out and do an interview with somebody who has pictures of to get his
That's
interview?
Pushing adultery.
Right. And so, I mean, so there were really people who were really disturbed by the fact of they acted like it was over his piety, but his real issue was over the hypocrisy of his piety. I mean, and this is the whole thing, it's just this. One of the things that I really want to pull out, we've been doing more political episodes, as we talked about, it was kind of a weird presidency. If you look, every presidential election is weird. Every presidential election is its own. The country is trying to figure things out, and the country is wrestling with real moral issues. And when you look at it, you can see God working. You can see the church failing. You can see, I mean, if you actually look at it, these things are not these minor things. There are real major things happening in the heart of the nation where people are, and the president and the people and all our representatives, they're all playing their part in as the world kind of determines how they're going to obey God or disobey God.
I think one of the things that all of us at the table would hold is that history, since the time of Jesus Christ, and before as well, but history since the time of Jesus Christ is about the growth and expansion of the Church of Jesus Christ. And so when we look at something like this, the election of Jimmy Carter, we're saying, how is this relevant to the church? What is God doing with the church? How does this explain what's happening with the church? Where does the church fit in all this? And it's not like we're trying to impose little tiny church things on big political issues. We're saying that the political things are the little tiny things, and what is God up to with the kingdom that he's building that all other kingdoms will submit to, including this American one.
Because we started this off with the kind of the blurb at the beginning was, how have we been impacted by Jimmy Carter? And there was a part of it where when I first read it, I was, we have really been impacted by Jimmy Carter. And then it's like, we really have been impacted by Jimmy Carter. And there's sort of this shock when you realize that, like, right now today, Jimmy Carter, I was 5 years old when he was, or I was 1 when he was elected maybe, and 5 whenever his office term ended. My life has been impacted by Jimmy Carter. There are things that I've held and things that I can see that I can look through this list and go, Jimmy Carter had an impact on me. And it's really easy just to go, oh, these things, they're just politics. It's really easy to be just like Jimmy Carter and go, my religion and these things don't matter in practice. And in reality, they matter far more than we even realize.
And, I see a lot of problems with Jerry Falwell. But Jerry Falwell, you look now and most evangelicals kind of go, how could you possibly support the Democratic Party? They're for the murder of babies.
Right.
And you have to recognize that by Carter stepping forward with these positions and living it out for 4 years, most evangelicals went, this is just wrong.
He became a caricature of Christianity.
And a lot of them may even think of him as a Christian, but they go, but Christianity is about protecting the unborn. It's not about saying, well, I feel like I should not protect or should not murder my child, but anybody else, I should let them murder their child. That's just so anti-Christ. I mean, it's so contrary to the teaching of Scripture, right? You look at Isaiah 1 of why God is judging Israel before he wiped them out as a nation. And he goes, you don't rebuke the oppressor. You don't defend the fatherless. You don't defend the widow. And here we turn around and we go, we should have nothing to do with defending the widow, defending the fatherless. We shouldn't care about the woman whose husband's committing adultery. We shouldn't care about their baby. We should have let them kill it because we're going to be good Christians and have nothing to do with it. Well, the church really kicked back against that. And so now you look in most churches that are considered Orthodox, people wouldn't even really think about voting for Democrats.
Right. And that's a good thing.
And that's a good thing. And a lot of them shouldn't think about voting for Republicans either. That would also be a good thing, but one step at a time. But there was a shift.
Right.
And there really was a shift and a kickback because of where Jimmy Carter went.
What a great legacy.
And at the end, God accomplished, like you were saying, the expansion of the church is happening. And there are things that you look at and you go, this was a bad thing. And then God used some of those bad. I mean, God does all of these things for the good of his people. And so, I mean, he causes people to look at these things and they change and they become more faithful in certain ways. And so through all of these things, that's really one of the things we should be understanding and remembering is God is faithful and he will sanctify his bride and he will be victorious.
I mean, if you think about just the doctrine by itself, the bad doctrine of a really strict separation of church and state, of an idea that one's political, religious views should not affect their public policies whatsoever. One way to get rid of that is for God to say, hey, here, let me give you one of those. See what it's like.
Right.
And you will have to suffer from the contradictions. That's a good way to refine your doctrine, is to suffer under the consequences of bad doctrine. And
I mean, just to talk about other effects of this view is when Jimmy Carter went into office, the first day he pardoned all the draft dodgers from Vietnam, which is it's hard to understand now how big of a deal that was. Here people ran to Canada, they fled, while other people went and lost their lives over this stuff, over a war that a lot of them didn't support, that they went, by law, I have to go, so I'm going to go. If you deserted after you said you'd go and you desert instead of dodging the draft in the first place, you weren't pardoned. And so he created this great division where he's going, hey, all sin's the same, but he doesn't treat it all the same. And he doesn't, right. And he basically says, well, you had to die because you submitted to the government, but we're just going to let these other people go. So we look now and we see these divisions in the society, and we have to recognize that some of these come from people like Carter and what he did. He really drove a wedge in the society. And it goes back to his understanding that, hey, all sin's the same, so why shouldn't I just pardon them? Another thing that hasn't had that much of an impact yet, but it really could have an impact, which is that we had the right to guard the Panama Canal. We had the right to the Panama Canal. We had built the Panama Canal. It was our money. It was in the control of the United States. And Jimmy Carter, he gave it to Panama. And like I said, it hasn't had that much impact now. But you have another world war, and that could have a huge impact, because if that gets shut off so that we have to take our ships the whole way around, now the largest ships can't go through there, but a lot of ships can go through there. And if we have to go the whole way around while our enemy is cutting across Panama, that has big geopolitical implications. And by giving up the protection of it and giving up our rights to it, I mean, it was a pretty significant thing that was done basically unilaterally by Carter pretty much. And we didn't really get anything in return. So we'll see what happens, whether that legacy is that damaging or not, but it could be really damaging.
Probably the first thing he did was write out plans in the Pentagon to recapture it.
Or to blow it up. We'd probably blow it up.
Just all in Panama. We're just no longer, that's just South America. Panama's gone.
No. I meant the canal.
One big nuclear warhead right into Panama. Panama Canal's gone. Now it's just ocean.
It's just a big, it's an even bigger canal. Now the big ships can go through.
I think you have a very poor estimation of how much a nuclear weapon can do.
Okay, if we put all the nuclear weapons.
Yes, I'm pretty sure we do.
Yes, they would do nothing. Over what? It's
3
miles or something.
So we've talked a decent bit throughout the episode about how Carter had this view of, that if you look back, he's presented as someone who was a very religious person. Joshua used the term pious, which I agree with. I mean, the way he's presented. And if you look at this, I mean, there were a lot of different components that made that up. I mean, he taught Sunday school for, how many, 60, was it 60 years?
I think it was over 70.
70 years that he's taught Sunday school. I mean, toward the end of his life, he was attending a church that had about 30 people that regularly attended, but he would still teach occasionally, and when he did, about 500 people would show up. I mean, so
when we look at that and we go, he taught Sunday school for 70 years, it's easy to start to think the same way that Carter did, right? Because in the end, that quote that he did to Playboy, he does basically attest to works-based righteousness.
Right.
He basically says you earn your way to heaven.
You make yourself acceptable to God by your actions.
You make yourself acceptable to God by your works, is what he said.
Right.
And so if we look and go, oh, he taught Sunday school for 70 years. I know of other people that taught Sunday school for 70 years, and they were all they were heretics. I'm not saying everybody.
They were all heretics.
All the ones that I know that taught for 70 years were heretics. That doesn't mean that all who taught for 70 years were heretics. But it's really easy to look at that and to think about it. And the reason he's judged as being pious and Christian and all this other stuff is really based on works-based righteousness. It's not based on the fact of what he believed, what he professed. If you believe in salvation by faith alone, then all of a sudden what he says he believed matters a lot, and not just the works that he did. Yes, he taught Sunday school,
right.
But the Pharisees taught what the Bible said, and they made their disciples twice the sons of hell that they were. So you can't just say, oh, he taught Sunday school. That makes him at all a Christian.
Right.
That just means he taught Sunday school. You even look at that Playboy interview. I mean, could you imagine somebody that was actually pious? And it's hard for us now because our society has become so coarse. At the level of pornography Playboy was considered at the time, right? I mean, Playboy was pornography. It was the well-known pornography.
Right.
And by appearing in that magazine, doing the multi-part interview in that magazine, he was driving sales of pornography. This is not a Christian thing to do. You don't support pornographers.
And he wasn't naive.
He wasn't naive. He was very wise, but he's also going, well, I'm doing it for political reasons, so the fact that it's causing people to sin, that's not my problem, because separation of church and state, I think, is how he would explain it to himself. But that doesn't mean that's how God looks at it. As far as I can see, the way that God would look at it is he's pushing pornography on people. He's effectively convincing them to buy pornography and to look at naked women and to lust after them, to commit adultery in their heart by saying, hey, if you want to read what I have to say about these things, you have to go buy pornography. So he was pushing pornography. That being a whoremonger is not a good thing. That's not a good sign for a Christian. That's effectively what he was participating in.
If we take this interview with Playboy as depicting either his naivete, which we don't think that he was, or just this calculated political view that costs women, I mean, it's really very destructive towards women, then there's other things that he says about women in religious contexts that are really relevant. I mean, for example, he left the SBC in 2000 because of their stance on women that he decided that he disagreed with. He said, I separated from the Southern Baptists when they adopted the discriminatory attitude towards women because I believe what Paul taught in Galatians, that there is no distinction in God's eyes between men and women, slaves and masters, Jews and non-Jews. Everybody is created equally in the eyes of God.
And it's worth looking at what Galatians 3:28, which is what he's referencing, says. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Well, is he really saying there's no male or female? Right? So all of a sudden, then you have to be advocating for homosexual marriage if you say there's no male or female. If you're saying that's what Paul says, then basically you've accepted the position. And Paul talks about when he goes to, when he goes to the Greeks, he's a Greek. When he goes to the Jews, he's a Jew. Paul clearly did not mean that. And you can especially see that in Ephesians 5:22 through 24. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. And so what Jimmy Carter was clearly doing is he took verses and he ignored the verses he didn't like and he embraced the verses that he liked. And again, we could assign to him, well, he just hasn't seen these. But he's the president. He's very prominent. People are pointing these things out to him. It's not like he can just go, oh, I just didn't know. He was hearing the arguments, and the arguments, at the SBC were pretty basic arguments. Right. And this is when the SBC, so when we think of the Southern Baptist Convention, we now think of it as very conservative. But that was because Paige Patterson came in and he was pushing a statement that made it more conservative. Because at the time when Jimmy Carter is in the Southern Baptist Convention, I know that we're near Southeastern, And at Southeastern, they would have chapel services where they would have responsive readings where the response is, I am woman, I am strong, from Helen Reddy's song. I mean, this is like, they were incredibly liberal. And so we look now and we go, oh, he's Southern Baptist. Well, Southern Baptist is not what we think of Southern Baptist when he was in the 70s, when he was a Southern Baptist. Right. And basically, I think the church he attends, somebody told me that it still holds to the doctrine that was the Southern Baptist doctrine at that point.
Right.
There was that is triggered by things like Jerry Falwell. It is triggered by these other people, that there was a reform movement. Even though Jerry Falwell has lots of problems, there's a reform movement that people go, wait a second, if our doctrine can go to the point where Jimmy Carter is, we need to rethink things. And there was a real return to Scripture that came from that. And when it came, Jimmy Carter's response is, I don't want anything to do with it.
Right.
Though he did still, to his death, go to a Southern Baptist church. So him leaving.
It's a Southern Baptist church that didn't adopt.
Right. It didn't adopt the 2000 faith and message. But the saying I'm leaving the SBC is, I mean, it's not a good thing to say. It's also a stunt where he's not actually leaving the church that is still part of the SBC.
Or that the SBC didn't require people to hold to the Baptist faith and message to be part of the SBC. You know what I mean? I mean,
right. We can talk about problems in the SBC in
right.
another podcast, because there are significant problems. And basically, if you say you're part of the SBC, you're part of the SBC. So we're still part of the SBC because we're holding to a very liberal statement of faith and not the Baptist faith and message, which was adopted out of a conservative movement that said the SBC has become apostate.
And it's ironic when you said that, if you hold this view of, that this is that men and women cease to exist functionally, which means they're completely equal in every single way, economically equal in identity, equal in value, equal in makeup, equal in everything, that you have to adopt the homosexual view, because by 2012, he supported gay marriage. And so, I mean, there's this part of it where whether maybe in 2000 he was already there, but he couldn't justify it in certain ways. But by 2012, he was openly supporting that.
And he was going along with where the Democratic Party was,
right.
Because the Democratic Party didn't become pro, civil union gay marriage until 2012. So
right.
He is putting his religious views, or at least his expression of religious views, is driven by his political views, not by the Bible.
Right. I mean, he still has this separation of church and state thing where, he wasn't supporting, decades before, he wasn't supporting the babies that were being killed. So why would he support marriage being destroyed?
Right, and if he doesn't support in a religious context even, where he can't say it's separation of church and state, if he doesn't support separate roles for men and women, how can you end up not accepting homosexuality? I mean, the two, you say there's no separate roles. Guess what? How can you say that there has to be a man and a wife then?
Right.
And he's not the first person to misquote that verse. He's not the last person to misquote it in exactly that sort of way, but he certainly is helping to lead in a bad direction by doing that. And the drift that he went through personally, going from the drift that he went through doctrinally down this slippery slope that, we were warned, don't talk about slippery slopes. Well, I mean, they happen. You can see it happen with this very public figure. It's happening all over the church. You have churches all over the place that are on this road right now. And, if it happens with your favorite conservative Presbyterian church here currently or in a decade, hey, it's just because you don't want to read all the Bible.
I mean, in a lot of ways, in certain ways at least, it wasn't a slippery slope, because he was supporting feminism as president. He was appointing, women and saying women should be able to, we need more women and judges and all these type of things. So, I mean, of course, he wasn't supporting homosexual marriage, but, some of this stuff, saying I'm going to leave the SBC over this, well, he had done that as president. He had worked against that as president.
And I mean, it's important to recognize, too, that we can talk about these things in the abstract, but the Bible says that Jesus Christ sent his Spirit, his Holy Spirit, to guide to truth. And so when you see somebody's expressed doctrine get worse and worse, it is testifying to whether they have the Holy Spirit or not. Because the Holy Spirit actually promises he guides towards truth. He convicts of sin. He teaches you things. Yes, you read the Word. You should read the Word. He gives you a hunger for the Word. But also the Word actually sanctifies your understanding. And so you can see this in certain people that you see them grow. I mean, I read something where that John MacArthur was talking about, the civil government, and his doctrine of the civil government in 2023 is much better than it was in 2020 or 2019. It has distinctly changed, and you can see it grow. But Carter, you see a consistent decline. So we shouldn't be thinking that's the work of the Holy Spirit there. There's no evidence that that's true. And we need to have a higher expectation that God will sanctify those who he saves. And we see no sanctification in the professed beliefs of Jimmy Carter.
We've done episodes about like Martin Luther King Jr. and saying, and Ravi Zacharias, and saying, here are sins that characterize them that don't characterize, true Christianity. And with Martin Luther King, here's heresies that he held. They were, far outside, the pale of Orthodox Christianity. I wouldn't want to be in Jimmy Carter's position. I wouldn't want to have these theological errors. And I'm not saying that he was a Christian. There's a lot of evidence that he was not, being sanctified. There's other things like honesty and things like that, and other work that he was doing. Like Habitat for Humanity. They were good things, but you look at in Corinthians, Paul talks about how there's you have works of hay and straw versus gold and silver, and one gets burned up. If someone wants to argue, well, he had vast amounts of works of wood and straw and only a little of silver and gold, well, potentially that's true. But you don't want to be following in his works of hay and straw. Whether he had any of silver and gold, hopefully for him he does. There were some good things he did, outwardly, but...
Although you're kind of twisting metaphors there, because even the ones that have it all burned with hay and straw, they still are saved.
That was my point. Says. I'm saying if someone wants to say, well, he was saved even though he had so many bad things, don't follow the bad things that he's doing. And don't say that he's a Christian, that he's doing these things as a Christian. This is what a Christian does.
I mean, I would just say, Christ gives a very clear warning. He says... those who mislead the little ones and teach them to disobey the things I commanded, it's better for them to have a millstone tied around their neck and thrown into a mill pond. Jimmy Carter misled a lot of people for a lot of years, and he was in a position of high prominence. And to those who much is given, much is expected. So we should be really just recognize, I would not want to be in Jimmy Carter's position.
That's what I say. That's why I started out with.
I'm just emphasizing that because there's lots of evidence that he was a false teacher that taught a nation false things that were very damaging to the nation. And God he is an avenger of God's wrath in that position. And you would expect God to teach him some things, and all you see him do is decline from his knowledge.
We just did a study on Psalm 119, and one of the verses was talking about, take not your words away from me, take not your words out of my mouth. And there's this part of it where in Romans, when it talks about getting turned over to things, there's this part of it where, like you said, there's the picture of the
specifically it's homosexuality, right?
Right. And so there's this picture of, like you said, sanctification, of growing more holy, of knowing more of God, and there's this picture of heading in that opposite direction. And like you said, I mean, it is not a good trajectory. The trajectory of Jimmy Carter's life was not a good trajectory, and the things that he was moving toward, it was not a good thing.
And Romans 1 says that if you don't want to retain God in your knowledge, that he'll turn you over to these unclean things. But the people who are turned over to him are not the only guilty ones. It's also the ones that approve. Jimmy Carter approved of homosexuality. It's really hard to say he wanted to retain God in his knowledge. In terms of his religious legacy, you can't talk about Jimmy Carter's religious legacy without mentioning Habitat for Humanity, because he ended up having a big impact on that organization. That organization was started very close to where he lived, and he was the one that made what was a small thing into a huge thing. Right now, I think they've said that they've either repaired or built 35 million homes across the world in most of the countries of the world. And has had a huge impact, and a lot of that was Jimmy Carter that popularized it. And in that, there were churches that hadn't been doing anything, hadn't been caring for the poor. And even if Jimmy Carter was doing it for the wrong motives, which you look at some of his theology, and it's easy to question whether he was doing it for the right motives, there were a lot of churches that started to do it for the right motives because they were doing it. I was in one that was looking at doing it, and we ended up not doing it, but we were looking at doing it specifically to try to help the poor. And so he caused it to cause people's eyes to be opened. And so in terms of his impact on the church, and, I think it had a real positive impact on the church.
And it was interesting because the way he was an impact on it in some ways was sort of by being an ordinary guy doing something where he clearly was not just an ordinary,
Right.
The fact that he wasn't an ordinary guy doing it, but doing it in that way was an act of real leadership that caused other people to follow in his example. I mean, it's after your, I mean, it actually, he was actually playing to his strengths.
Right.
So one of the other things that Jimmy Carter did is he started the Carter Center, which was really just an organization kind of structured around allowing, kind of basically allowing him to do different things in the world, different either philanthropic or political activities, whether it was going in and monitoring elections, whether it was going in and negotiating peace treaties in certain areas. I mean, and he won a Peace Prize for that. And in 2002, he won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work associated with the Carter Center. I mean, and this, the Carter Center has been around for. Did he form it right after?
Right afterwards.
I mean,
and basically, this is you go back to the Camp David Accords, and this was a big deal, right? Because there was basically all the nations in the world against Israel, and then all of a sudden Egypt goes to a peace agreement. So from that, Carter was seen as this great negotiator and this great mediator. And so he establishes the Carter Center to basically do mediation. And I think he got involved in mediation in a bunch of countries. And then he also, because he was going to countries to mediate between disputes between countries, that he started to oversee elections. And so he ended up going to something like 89 countries to oversee their elections. And these are the things that he was awarded the Peace Prize for, is the work that the Carter Center did and that he did there. And so, I'm not sure that had that big of an impact, because a lot of times when you think of what a president does in terms of negotiation, everything's always negotiated before they have the final negotiation. And so Carter wasn't like a brilliant negotiator, but he's bringing attention to it by going, because, you go to these countries in Africa and South America and in Eastern Europe that are small countries that, it's very prestigious to have a former U.S. president come. And so, he's a catalyst for things. So I'm not denying that he was a catalyst, but I think sometimes people really exalt everything that he did afterwards, and it's probably lifted up too high. Just like during his presidency, there were some real problems with his presidency, but they also ignore the things that he did well.
I mean, even just being at certain elections would have some impact on things. The fact that there's a former president there, it would have a constraining effect on some types of things, right? I mean,
you'd have to shift the fraud to a different point.
Exactly. I mean, and he did more for his Peace Prize, for his Nobel Peace Prize, than President Obama did. I think we can say that.
I think we can all safely say that he did more. And he did some humanitarian things. There was a worm that was affecting like 3.5 million. And
You've all read The Hungry Caterpillar. You just didn't know who it was about.
I mean, there was the guinea worm, I think it was, there was a really medical problem, and that through medication stuff he was able to distribute, he basically wiped it out. And so there were other humanitarian things that he did. What are you shaking your head?
Came really close to you all. I mean, he started to laugh about his fight with the one worm. Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, millions of doses of medication. I made this medication. Here, take it.
The rabbit that he fought in the swamp, he actually trained it, and he would ride it into battle.
You guys obviously have never had parasites, or you take this more seriously.
No, we grew up in America.
I've had parasites. I've been to Nigeria. Trust me, it's a big deal.
Especially if it's one worm across 3 million people.
I never said one worm.
There was this one worm in particular.
So as with most men, Jimmy Carter had a mixed legacy, as what he did as president, what he did in his post-presidency. And so as we look back, we should recognize that the things that people do, especially people that God has appointed as his civil magistrates, the avengers of his wrath that he put in high positions, they have real impacts on our lives. So as we consider Jimmy Carter and consider his legacy, let's just remember that the things that he caused to have impacts on this world, the next president that we elect, he'll have impacts too that we'll feel 20, 30, 40 years later. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.